Dear colleagues, we welcome you to our Arria-formula meeting focusing on the crimes of Ukrainian army and militia committed in the context of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. Today we will try to speak as little as possible by ourselves and to share with you accounts of the residents of eastern and southern Ukraine and to give the floor to foreign journalists who have been working in these areas. If you read the Western mainstream media and listen to the Western Ukrainian politicians, you will have in your mind more or less the following picture of what is happening in Ukraine. Russia, jealous of its neighbors' success and prospects to become a member of the European Union and a part of a free civilized world, launched a full-scale invasion against this country. Russian forces committed and continue to commit atrocities, and brave Ukrainian army and defenders tried to shelter them from terrible Russian indiscriminate shellings. The reality, however, is strikingly different, and Ukrainian authorities and their Western backers are not interested in shedding any light on it. I will not raise here the issue of blatant and heinous provocations of Ukraine and its sponsors like Bucha, Kramatorsk and Irpin. This setup is so obvious that the UK Presidency of the Security Council even decided, in total breach of the Council's rules of procedure, to deny us our right to call for an urgent meeting on Bucha provocation. I will just try to debunk some of the myths promoted by Ukraine by passing the microphone to fellow residents of Ukraine who faced gruesome reality on the ground. As you all know, even military activities have their laws. They are called international humanitarian law, which roughly boils down inter alia to the following principles: no usage of civilian infrastructure for military purposes, no placement of heavy weaponry in residential areas, no use of civilian population as human shield, and dignified treatment of the prisoners of war. We have reasons to believe that all those principles are systematically violated by the Ukrainian army and militia. There are many witnesses claiming that Ukrainian army is using civilians as hostages and human shield. This is how, for example, the Azov battalion defense tactics in big cities, namely Mariupol, look like. Please look at the first video. А где ваше изображение?
У вас здесь.
Вот здесь ничего нет.
Объясни там, смотри. Пардон.
You may see on the screen how they normally place themselves on the first and upper floors of the residential buildings, while civilian population is kept hostage right in the middle of the house. Tanks are placed under the arches, if there are any. The whole building turns into an artillery position. There are a lot of accounts of Ukrainian military placing tanks, artillery and rocket launching systems in residential areas, often despite clear protests of those who live in these neighborhoods, thus turning these buildings into a kind of a sandwich. And that's how residents of Ukrainian cities describe it. Please show the second video.
Не выпускают, расстрелял 2 автобуса. Они там дети были. Люди кричат, что вы делаете? Это же дети. Они сказали, что на войне детей и стариков нету.
Мне вот это на 13-й этаж забегали, с 13 этажа стреляли. Мамы в Куприна 69 просто обстреливали людей.
Сходское отношение к людям, мы были как пушечное мясо, которым просто манипулировали. Они отстреливались из дворов, с танков, из этих пулеметов.
Под пулями все там, все горит. Все, нету ни дорог, ни домов, вообще ничего нету. И все это время у нас азовцы просто прятались за нами. Они просто приезжали, ставили танки, мы прятались, чтобы нас не постреляли, все.
Стреляли в нас, и попал осколок, выбило стекло. Поэтому мы прятались в подвале 6 дней, а потом бежали.
Дома рушат, все рушат, стреляют куда попало. Снайпер застрелил там женщину.
Там видимо все побили.
Кто?
Вот эти наши, что воюют.
Кто?
Украинцы эти, Не выпускали людей?
Нет, не выпускали. Они только водку там пили. Больше не делали. Господи, прости.
Попали под грады нашего дорогого украинского укропа. Я не знаю, как назвать. Они стреляли в одно, а попали в другое здание. Они попали в 9-этажный дом. Первый этаж у нас, прострелили полностью весь дом. У нас одни окна в одну сторону, другие в другую. В один момент начался большой пожар. Мы все погорели. У них на лбу написано, кто они такие и как они себя ведут. Они очищают территорию. Я вам говорю, не потому что они хотят очистить. 100% театр накрыл наш укроп. Весь город это знает. Так что такое 500 человек переселенцев под...
We would like to draw your attention to these words about the theater in Mariupol, which was allegedly destroyed by the Russian armed forces.
Они их закопали и все.
Машину, да?
Нас обстреляли машину без предупреждения.
Это где? В
На
каком...
гостинице «Азовсталь». Мы хотели выехать с левого берега.
И на вас,
На
вас
гостинице
обстреляли?
«Азовсталь» без предупреждения обстреляли 2 машины. Наши машины стреляли по ногам, попали, я была за рулем, мне в порог и мужу в порог, хотели, видать, тоже нам по ногам. А заднюю дверь обстреляли полностью, и вот результат, дочь моя по касательной, мамы 2 насквозь ноги. У ребенка сзади пяточка тоже по касательной.
Ужас.
Вторая машина, которая ехала с нами, мужчине, кто был за рулем, 2 насквозь пули прошли. У жены бедро тоже простреленное насквозь. Дети, слава богу, чудом не пострадали. У него даже...
видно было, кто стрелял? Азов, ВСУ?
Мы остановились, и мы кричали, мы мирные, мы хотим выехать, пропустите нас. У нас вся машина была обклеена, дети. Мы кричим им, пожалуйста, пропустили. Они на українському язикі нам отвечают, геть звідси. Звідки приїхали, туди і вертайтеся.
То есть они вас загоняли обратно?
Да, они нас загоняли обратно. Вот и все. И мы так и не выехали, поехали обратно. Пробыли еще 3 дня, они пришли в наш дом, сказали, валите отсюда, здесь будет наш госпиталь. Ну, хотите, говорит, оставайтесь.
А какой адрес там был?
Ламизова, 13.
Ламизова, 13. То есть там сидят сейчас...
Они там сейчас сидят.
Нацики?
Да, они там сейчас сидят, нас выгнали. И мы вот так вот как были и пошли. Слава Богу, ваших ребят встретили по дороге, Господи.
We have a lot of accounts of people prohibited to exit besieged cities through humanitarian corridors opened by Russia, and even not knowing about the existence of such corridors. I apologize in advance to the Russian-speaking audience. This video contains some obscenities, but we found it necessary to keep the speech as it is. Третье видео.
Украинские военные как-то помогали вам, давали зеленый коридор?
Вообще никто ничего не давал, никаких коридоров.
В подвалах сидели.
Азов, сука, выезжали люди, Азов, блядь, расстреливал пидорасы, сука. Что Азов делал? Расстреливал колонны, блядь, мирных, нахуй, пытались выезжать на Володарск, расстреливали автобусы, блядь.
Выехали откуда?
С Мариуполя.
Как вы смогли выехать?
Помогали. Российские войска. Большое спасибо. Украина.
Почему? А украинская армия не помогала вам?
Украинская армия стреляла.
Прям в дом.
Я не хочу.
Вы рады, что вы выехали?
Конечно, рада. Спасибо вам огромное.
Мы 26 числа и в подвале сидим.
В подвале сидело 300 человек. Это в одном только доме.
Почему вы раньше не выехали?
А нас никто не выпускал оттуда.
Не давали коридор. Украина не выпускала из города полностью, заблокированы были. Приезжали военные, говорят, ни в коем случае не выезжайте из города, если вам будет предоставлен коридор Российской Федерации. Они хотели дальше нами прикрываться и все.
A lot of these crimes are attributed to the so-called units of territorial defense, which were recklessly armed by Ukrainian authorities, despite the fact
where the shells came from.
Sorry. A lot of these crimes are attributed to the so-called units of territorial defense, which were recklessly armed by Ukrainian authorities, despite the fact that there are a lot of convicted criminals and inmates let out of prisons in their ranks. That resulted in anarchy and widespread lootings in a number of cities. There are a lot of witnesses and deliberate attacks on there is a lot of evidence of deliberate attacks on residential blocks, houses, and civilian infrastructure by Azov and Ukrainian army detachments to present this as a result of Russian military operation, to compromise our claims that we use only high-precision weapons and do not target civilian infrastructure. Четвертое видео.
On the side where the shells came from, there was no one else except the Ukrainian troops. There was no DPR or Russia on that side at the time. In my presence, when two 16 and 17-year-old girls asked a Ukrainian soldier when all this would be over, the guys said openly that whoever couldn't leave the city would die with them. That's all. What else can one say about our own defenders, which they call themselves? When the Russian military came here, they talked to us like human beings. And the others, before they left, spoke only in foul language. That's their military prowess. That's their military honor. When Russia entered, people started to be given humanitarian aid and food. But while Ukraine was here, all we were given were cookies and a pack of wet wipes. What do I need a pack of wet wipes for? We don't have running water. The Ukrainian armed forces waited for a large number of people to gather and hit these wells. And then they beautifully told us that it was Russia. Where did Russia hit the wells from? I wonder. Straight from Moscow? We had been paying the military tax for 8 years. For what? For all this? For the burned down buildings? Our mayor is exactly the same. Everybody stays in their cities. And our mayor is beautifully broadcasting from Lviv. Guys, the situation in Mariupol is fabulous. Where is it fabulous? I have 2 kids hiding in my basement right now. My neighbor has 2 other kids hiding in the basement too. They lost their parents. Just yesterday we were listening to the radio. Our great mayor of Mariupol was speaking and he said that children even go to schools. Where are these schools? Has at least one of them survived? The Ukrainian military drove into schools and fired mortars directly from them.
But these leftovers of the Ukrainian army, they just entertain themselves by shooting at little children. We saw it with our own eyes. You must show this to the whole world. Not only Ukraine says that it is a beautiful country. Not a single Ukrainian military man took us out of the basements. Not a single one. And one more question. Although I am weak in politics, I am not a soldier, but what I saw with my own eyes, I think if they are defending the city, they should be on the outskirts. If you can't defend it, drop your guns, give up, leave. But they started hiding in residential areas, in schools, in kindergartens, in areas with residential buildings. They simply went in, and those who were caught by the ass by the Russian troops, they said, "We will not get out of here alive. We will cover ourselves with living meat." Here is the living meat that survived. It is us. That's all. Tell the whole world how Ukraine screwed up. Now, guys, what else I want to say? 85% of destructions in Mariupol was caused by our Ukrainian army, because we personally saw how they came in the vehicles with mortars. And right there, 100 meters away, 50 meters away, there's a shot. A shell flies over the head and explodes in the same village. I counted 10 shots twice. They were definitely destroying our infrastructure. I don't know where this order came from. As to Russians, our low bow to Russians, guys.
How on earth can we explain to anybody that Ukrainian soldiers shoot at us, Ukrainian civilians? A guy went out to his balcony to smoke. There were 2 Ukrainian soldiers on the tank on the street, and one said to another, "Can you hit him?" The guy threw the stab out and ran away. Imagine there are kids in the yard, 2 Ukrainian soldiers come over, one of them takes 2 automatic rifles simultaneously and starts shooting into the air. Then he says, "Kneel." He was definitely on drugs. I don't understand the Ukrainian army. Whom are they fighting for? Even the state abandoned them. They kept stealing food from all apartments. They wrapped it in towels and lowered down on ropes. They had some kind of a device to open locked doors. They opened all the doors in all the apartments. They grabbed all food wrapped in the bedding sheets and took away. People were complaining. They kept saying, "We bought this food, these were our preserves for emergency," and these thugs just came and grabbed everything. Shame on them.
Нам помощь оказывает российская армия. Мы не хотим ничего слышать про наших так называемых защитников, которые прятались за нашими юбками, которые выбрасывали людей в подвалы, стариков за руки, за ноги. Люди шли в свои квартиры, хотели взять покушать детям маленьким. Они их посылали, извините меня, матом. Ни от одного чеченского воина, ни от одного воина ДНР, ни от одного воина российского мы даже не слышали грубого слова. Помогают ребята, чем могут, хотя они в этом не обязаны. Спрашивают, приходят, вам не холодно, вам сытно, вы живы, здоровы, все, постоянно помогаю. Спасибо большое. Наконец мир увидел, кто есть кто, понимаете?
The situation around evacuation of civilians from Mariupol is extensively covered in the news right now. The relevant information is heavily distorted by the Ukrainian and Western media. Let's listen to some of our witnesses, and I would like to give the floor to my friend and colleague Dmitry Polyansky, First Deputy Permanent Representative, who will introduce you to one interesting interview.
First, let's watch the file, please.
Здесь у нас дедушка умер.
Здравствуйте.
Здравствуйте.
Можно сказать, что произошло?
13 числа утром, 12:30 день, и в нас прилетел снаряд. Получается, на нас сверху упал потолок. Я когда вылезла, я подползла к папе, было очень больно. И после того, как нам помогли притащить меня в подвал в соседний гараж, мне там останавливали кровь очень долго, 2-3 часа. И на следующий день, получается, я узнаю, что мама с бабушкой не вернутся. И потом мы решили, что надо уезжать отсюда. Мы узнали, что здесь есть бомбоубежище, что здесь есть медики, которые могут мне помочь. И на следующий день, утром, как только мы проснулись, мне сделал папа, перевязал ногу. После чего мы хотели выехать и опять пытались по нам стрелять.
Кто?
Азов.
Как вы знаете это Азов?
На тот момент ДНРовцев не было.
Угу.
Я видела только украинцев, украинскую армию, которые пытались стрелять по нам. И после того, как мы уехали оттуда, не переставали бомбить их, гаражи. И после того, как мы приехали уже сюда, они встали здесь и спрятались за больных, за больницу, которые и уже, их уже нет, и нам помогала ДНРовская армия. И мне помогли, перевязывали ноги, руки, голову. Все уже хорошо. И спасибо российской армии.
Спасибо российской?
Да.
Как на Европа США, они все сказали, это Россия стреляет на меня.
Нет. Дома уничтожили украинская армия. Нам помогает российская армия водой, хлеб, еда, то есть что-нибудь, помогали нас вывозить, больных, раненых, всех. Спасибо.
Извините, как зовут?
Валерия Алексеевна.
Ага, фамилия?
Петренко.
Ага.
Петренко Валерия Алексеевна.
Это был твой...
Да, это был мой отец, который помог вытащить меня из обломков.
Ага. Извините.
Very moving footage and credit to Patrick Lancaster, who planned to be with us, but he couldn't. So it's his coverage of what's happening now in Ukraine, in Mariupol. I want to make a reference to how Western mainstream media cover the topic of people evacuated from Mariupol. It's puzzling because they have the same materials as their Russian colleagues, same settings, same witnesses. But what is extremely disappointing is that Western journalists, in most cases, clearly engage in censorship, concealing awkward information from Western public. That's the way the new Iron Curtain is being created. I will give you only one very recent example. On May 2, a group of journalists from many countries interviewed a group of evacuees from the Azovstal steel works. One of them, Natalia Usmanova, was very vocal and emotional. That's why she appeared in many footages. For example, she spoke with Reuters, and this agency published a short report with a video reel at its website. Here is the screenshot of this report from the website. You see it here. I will first read what Reuters journalists relayed from her interview. Natalia Usmanova felt her heart would stop. She was so terrified as Russian bombs rained down on Mariupol, sprinkling her with concrete dust. Then there is a quote. I feared that the bunker would not withstand it. I had terrible fear, Usmanova said. We didn't see the sun for so long, she said. She recalled the lack of oxygen in the shelters and the fear that had gripped the lives of people hunkered down there. Usmanova joked with her husband on the bus that they would no longer have to go to the lavatory with a torch. And then again the quote. You just can't imagine what we have been through. The terror, Usmanova said. I lived there, worked there all my life. But what we saw there was just terrible. And now let's watch the video reel that was published at Reuters' website. Sorry, some glitch, but we'll cope with it. Sorry, I think it doesn't work. We did it just this morning, and it's very fresh. But if we don't cope with it, then we'll give you a link, and you can watch it yourself. It's at the Reuters website there. The length is 1 minute. And what's the impression that you get from this coverage? Natalia Usmanova is terrified, frightened by Russian strikes. She must be hating Russia for what it did to Ukraine. Thank God she is safe and can go to Ukraine. That's what the impression that you get from watching this video reel and from reading the coverage on Reuters' website. But Reuters, in fact, heavily censored what she said in reality. So let's watch the remaining part of Natalia's account, which was shown in full on Russian TV.
Не знаю, можно такое говорить? Мы честно, мы запуганы, мы не знаем, что можно говорить, что нельзя говорить, честно. Украину не говорить все, что угодно. Украину не хочу, честно. У нас семья решила единогласно в Украину не хочу. Но если мы и решим вернуться, то только в Мариуполь, но не на Украину. То есть Украина как государство, да, вот как я гражданка Украины, ну, оно для меня умерло. Вот этими всеми людьми, кто с нами такое сделал. Потому что, ну, я считаю, это тоже их вина в том, что они не договорились, правильно, не решили мирным путем этот конфликт изначально. Вот у меня вопрос, почему людей задержали в городе? То есть вы уже понимаете, начался обстрел, хотя мэр первый уехал с города. Мэр уехал, покинул город, а людей зажали в кольце, и стояла украинская армия, которая просто народ, обычное население, детей, стариков, больных не выпускали. Спрашивается, почему, зачем, за что?
So, colleagues, it's clear from this video reel what's the real mood of Natalia Usmanova. And it's really hard to comment this shameless manipulation. How will Western viewers learn the truth, especially when Russian TV channels, as we all know, are being banned from Western countries? Who is spreading propaganda here? Make a judgment yourself. And my personal remark, shame on you, Reuters. Instead of promoting journalism and freedom of speech and access to information, you choose the path of becoming soldiers of information war against Russia. And by the way, German Spiegel published a more extended version of the interview with Natalia Usmanova, and after several hours deleted it. We don't have any doubts why.
Having watched all those video reels, we might ask a question: why would Ukrainian fighters treat their fellow citizens in such a condescending, denigrating, inhumane way? Why would they destroy Ukrainian cities and not care about the fate of the civilians? The answer is very simple, yet difficult to digest. Azov battalions and other nationalists simply do not treat this population as their equals, as fellow citizens of their country. Let's watch some witnesses giving proof to such shameful situation. Another important issue that we can't avoid touching is the sadistic cruelty of the Ukrainian militia towards the Russian military detainees. We intentionally will not demonstrate today the relevant videos, but there are plenty of them in the social media. Russian soldiers with arms tightened behind their backs are shot in their legs, their throats are being cut, they are beaten all over, and their bones are being broken sadistically. And all those tortures are filmed by proud Ukrainian militia. To prevent you from going into another round of needless accusations of the Russian propaganda, we are simply inviting you to watch the following.
Имейте в виду, что специальное обращение к русскому солдату. Имейте в виду, что украинская армия, добровольческие батальоны на самом деле в плен русских солдат не берут. А что с вами потом делать? Вы потом будете в Гаагском трибунале, потом плакаться, что вас плохо кормили в наших тюрьмах. Поэтому имейте в виду, мы все понимаем, и каждый наш солдат понимает. Когда мы смотрим на то, что вы делаете с нашими городами, у нас просто нету выбора. Мы понимаем, что вашу нацию, в принципе, нужно уничтожить, если мы хотим выжить. Поэтому эта война идет на уничтожение. И наши войска, все наши люди знают, что никого в плен брать не надо. Если у вас есть сомнения, я сейчас пообщаюсь с нашими бойцами. Ви будете в полон когось брати? Полонених не буде. Скажіть, будь ласка, ви будете в полон когось брати? Еще чего? Можно на русском языке объяснить ситуацию в Украине и почему мы не берем в плен русских солдат?
Тюрьма – это аморально, а кладбище – это прибыльно. Поэтому у нас для вас кладбище, а не тюрьма.
We apologize for some certain technical glitches that occurred, not so many though, but we thought that you might not be able to watch this anywhere else, but unless we showed it to you. Colleagues, we tried to show to you only some of the accounts of the victims of the crimes and denigrating treatment by Ukrainian army and nationalists. We have many more. This is only a small fraction. We document them to ensure accountability for those who committed these crimes. But because of time limits, we will stop at this point and give the floor to our distinguished briefers. They come from different countries, but have one thing in common. They all have first-hand experience of working in areas of our special military operation. Many of them were also covering the 8 years-long war waged by Ukraine against residents of Donetsk and Lugansk. Our first briefer hardly needs any introduction. We have the pleasure to welcome Anne-Laure Bonnel, French journalist who has already done invaluable work to shed light on the life of civilian population of Donbass, who has been simply cancelled in the humane West. Please.
Good morning. The 2022 Russian offensive is a tragedy for Ukraine. But let's keep in mind that Eastern Ukraine has suffered since 2014. The past throws light upon the present. May 2014 Ukrainian helicopter gunship firing at civilians, killed instantly or worse, still alive and speaking whilst their body cut in two. These images will forever haunt people from the East. Along with Odessa massacre, these crimes have no gone unpunished. So, yes, I do hope the negotiation, a peace agreement, are still possible. Moreover, we are the few French reporters who witnessed the latest developments. My testimony is in tune with those of my colleagues, Lise Romboudoul from TF1, the first French journal documents shooting and killing in Donetsk. Furthermore, the American training of volunteers was reported by journalist Régis Le Sommier during his stay in Odessa. Peace is not made only by written agreements. Peace is made and maintained by peoples. How appeasement can be guaranteed after a conflict if the communities have been turned against each other, armed again and again, and have learned to hate and detest one another? Sending ever heavier and deadlier weapons to Ukraine. Leaders of the countries not involved in the conflict only contribute to further escalation, resulting in ever more victims, tears, and resentment for years and decades to come. Flooding a country with arms is nowhere near United Nations. Do not forget your primary role. The entire world has to urge for dialogue and mediation immediately in a bid to restore peace. Pushing Germany towards remilitarization endangers Europe. The continent is on the verge of a collapse. A world war with the epicenter in Europe is becoming more and more plausible. Nuclear danger has to be taken seriously. The conflict has been going on for 8 years. Is it the lack of dialogue and failure to fulfill previous commitments that resulted in the tragic invasion we now regret? I will forever wonder. The solution, if any, is in your hands. Humanity relies on you, and the virtue of meetings like that of Mr. Guterres on April 26, 2022 in Moscow. Every life lost is a failure. Every life saved is a victory. Today, in the sanctuary of the United Nations, it is you who guard the deals and conscience. Heavy responsibility and tremendous honor wanting to you should encourage you to prioritize peaceful disarmament. I'd like to conclude with a quote. Humanity is cursed if it is condemned to kill forever for the sake of showing courage. Courage is rather about not resorting to force in a conflict that can be resolved by reason. Thank you. Now I would like to show you some of my witnesses from the heart of the Donbass. Thank you.
Мариуполь, как вы вышли из города?
Пришли военные, русские.
ДНР?
Ну, наверное, ДНР, да. Сперва они ночевали у нас в гараже, а потом утром нас забрали, вывели.
А скажите, в каком районе Мариуполя вы живете?
Ну, это левый берег. Окраина, левый берег.
Позвольте вопрос. Вот Азов что делает с мирными гражданами? Насколько вам известно, удерживает людей? Как?
Я ничего не знаю, мы сидели дома в подвале с детьми. Что там кто делает, я без понятия. О коридорах я не слышала, не знаю.
Скажите, пожалуйста, вы видели какую-то военную технику в жилых застройках? Вот, украинских?
БТР.
То есть технику ставят в жилых застройках?
Ну, ставили на нашей улице, там, да, во дворе родном.
Как вас зовут?
Анна.
Азов занимает жилые дома, бьют людей, не выпускают из домов. Обстановка в городе крайне печальная.
Как конкретно происходит?
Конкретно происходит. Бьют прикладами, не выпускают из домов.
А как у тебя получилось выбраться из города?
Выбраться из города? Я ушел по берегу. Я ушел по берегу моря, по частным и по полям. Я дошел до трассы, я прошел 17 километров.
Vous pouvez me dire ce qui s'est passé à Mariupol, comment s'est passé le corridor?
Я знаю точно, что людей не выпускают из домов, их бьют прикладами и заставляют их сидеть дома. Батальон Азов не позволяет ни пройти, ни проехать. Я лично знаю человека, которому просто не дали выйти.
Prouve bien que vous avez donc toutes ces coordonnées, ces informations. Ukraine, il accuse le bataillon Azov d'exactions contre la population.
А вы знали, что коридоры есть?
Нет.
Сказали, идите, собирайте фонарик, берите вещи и идите в бомбоубежище. Все, что сказали.
То есть вас вывели донецкие военные,
да, вывели донецкие. Они вечером пришли, они у меня ночевали, охраняли нас.
Расскажи, как себя вели украинские военные.
Да никак они, ни слова, ни полслова ничего не говорили. Мы спрашивали, что делать, как здесь с детьми быть, что, как эвакуация будет какая-то. Нет, у меня 3 маленьких деток. И как выходить, никто ничего не говорил. Говорили, берите все необходимое, идите в бомбоубежище. Все, что они сказали. Они, наверное, направленно так делали. Люди стояли, оставались на местах. Насколько я слышал, они жилые сектора заводили гаубицы свои и оттуда палят.
Как тебя зовут?
Илья.
А фамилия?
Клочко.
I thank Anne-Laure Bonnel. And our second brief is Giorgio Bianchi, Italian photojournalist, director, filmmaker, and writer. He covered widely the armed conflict in Syria and the Ukrainian crisis starting from Euromaidan. In his work, Giorgio always pays particular attention to humanitarian and anthropological issues. He also made interview with a young lady, Marianna, whose photos spread with rocket speed around the Western media as a victim of the alleged Russian artillery attack on the maternity hospital in Mariupol. How many times we have heard in the Security Council these blatant lies from our Western colleagues. Giorgio, the floor is yours.
Good evening. It is truly an honor for me to be here. I recently returned from Donbass, where for about 2 months I documented the conflict. I have to say that I was expecting the difference between the reality on the field and in the media, but not at these levels. I can understand Russian propaganda. I can understand Ukrainian propaganda. What remains incomprehensible to me is European propaganda. With the Russian media censored and with all the so-called official media aligned on the Ukrainian propaganda, for the European public, I'm European, it is practically impossible to form an objective opinion on the reality on the ground. For this reason, more and more people are asking to the web for balanced information. Governments and digital platforms, instead of questioning themselves about this phenomenon, are trying to limit access to information online. It seems like their goal is to endorse a single narrative of the facts. War is dramatic in itself, and I know something about it. But there is no need to make it even more horrifying by flooding ether and paper with fake news. I think it is useful to anyone to feed the conflict. I think it is useful to anyone to feed the conflict or widen it, feeding hatred. It seems to me that there is a sort of interest to ensure that the conflict lasts a long time and spreads. I have personally exposed several fake news spread in the European media. The shameful front page of La Stampa, which cunningly attributes to the Donetsk death of March 14 to the Russians. The fact that Mariana, the girl who was the symbol of the bombing of the Mariupol hospital, had not been kidnapped by the Russians. The fact that the Russians were not deporting civilians from Mariupol. They could not evacuate all the civilians who wanted to leave. They certainly did not take away those who wanted to stay. On the contrary, I have shown that Ukrainian soldiers and militias have extensively used civilians as human shields. The testimonies I have collected are dozens, and the very majority of them confirm it. There is no trace of this fact-checking in the mainstream press. What game are we playing? Do we want the Third World War? Do we want to reduce European populations to misery with sanctions? I'm an independent reporter. My work has been recognized internationally, but I cannot work in Ukraine because I'm on a blacklist, Miratvorets, in which I'm defined as a criminal, only for doing my job and bringing my point of view to the audience, a point of view documented by 8 years of work on the field. Today, I'm accused by the audience of being an embedded professional, but I can't work on the other side because I risk to be arrested. Do you think it's normal? Another time, what game are we playing? For sure, it is a very dangerous game. Thank you very much.
I thank Giorgio Bianchi, and I'd like to give the floor and greet Salem Abdelmounem, mainly known as Salam Al-Abaidi. He is the head of Moscow and North European Bureau of the independent pan-Arabic telecommunications network Al-Muyaddin. He began his journalistic career back in the late 80s of the last century, working as a translator in a number of Soviet foreign broadcasting publications. Later, he worked as a correspondent for a number of Arab media in Moscow. He is a universal journalist and has covered various spheres of life in Russia, the CIS, the Baltic and Northern European states. He has extensive experience working in hotspots such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and so on. Please have the floor.
Have we lost connection, or is our briefer still with us?
I'm sorry, I think it was a problem with the voice. Do you hear me now? Do you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Nibenza, and very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to participate today in this event organized by the Russian mission to the United Nations. And first of all, I want to hope that my humble participation will bring us at least a little closer to the truth about what has happened and is happening in Donbass. Perhaps this will help you make the right decision and contribute to ending the bloodshed in Ukraine. And for this, first of all, it is necessary, as I think, to stop the supply of weapons to the Kyiv regime. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to have the opportunity to share my impressions with you after visiting a number of cities and towns in Donbass. The first thing I want to say is that I focused in my reports on the statements of the residents themselves, their moods, and those facts that speak for themselves in every destroyed house, rushed ward in a hospital, a broken window, and a sports ground at school. And of course, it is impossible to bypass the drama in Drama Theater in Mariupol. And probably, and this is the most important thing, I want to emphasize that despite the excesses of the radicals and nationalists, people have not lost their humanity and craving for peace and creation. I was in Donbass, I've been in Donetsk and Lugansk People Republics in early April last time. Then the city of Mariupol was mostly liberated from radicals. Also, we visited the liberated cities of Volnovakha and Shastya. In my 7 stories that I shot there, I tried to reflect the real picture of what I saw and heard. And I saw destruction all the time. I heard the stories of brave people who want to turn this tragic page in the fate of their land and start a new life as free people. And I want, what I will present to you, court today, is a squeeze from my these 7 stories from Donbass. Please start the movie.
Война ужасная вещь. Вот когда я шел по городу с мамой, ну, когда мы там в центре сидели в подвале. Так вот, мы шли, когда я увидел город, мне захотелось залезть под стол. Все дома большие, такие возле драмтеатра были, выгоревшие. Они были красивые очень, с подсветкой. Помню, драмтеатра нет. В общем, война ужасная вещь. Это я говорю всем.
نعم، الحرب شيء فظيع. من الصعب العثور على الكلمات بعد كل ما سمعته. ولن أقول الكثير، دع شهود العيان أنفسهم. أولئك الذين نجوا من كل هذه الأهوال يخبرون عما حدث في دونباس. هذا أحد مراكز توزيع المساعدات الإنسانية ولا سيما الغذائية لسكان مدينة ماريوبول التي لا تزال تشهد معارك ضارية.
Спасибо, что принесли, помогают людям. Мы очень благодарны тем, что нам помогают.
Известно, что там была очень долгая линия фронта, более 3 недель, это то, что мы знаем. Там шли жестокие бои. Этот район, жилфонд, квартиры людей, дома практически разбиты все, потому что мы рядом живем с этим районом. И мы живем параллельная улица Бахчеванжи. Квартира сгорела.
هناك العديد من المرضى والجرحى في ماريوبول المدمرة. المستشفيات تفتقر إلى كل شيء تقريبا، ومع ذلك فإن الأطباء لا يستسلمون.
Оперативный блок, то есть кому-то оказывается помощь на месте, и он может лечиться дальше амбулаторно, он приходит на перевязки, если ему есть где жить. Те, кто нуждается в стационарном лечении, помещаются в отделение травматологии, в отделение хирургии.
Вернемся сейчас оттуда сюда, и можно будет тоже посмотреть.
المستشفيات هي المكان المفضل للتشكيلات المسلحة الأوكرانية، وكثيرا ما استخدموا المرافق الطبية كوكر لإطلاق النار على القوات المتقدمة للشرطة الشعبية والجيش الروسي، بينما كانوا يتخذون من المرضى والعاملين في القطاع الطبي دروعا بشرية. مستشفى المدينة في Волноваха ليس استثناء.
Русские не покидали этот населенный пункт, покидали украинские военные. И трупы были гражданского населения. Вот, и по уходу у нас украинские военные спалили нам детское отделение. У нас разбито инфекционное отделение, где проводилось лечение пациентам с COVID-19. Мы прожили 18 суток, я и мои коллеги. Вот у нас работала неврология, реанимационное отделение. И здесь травматология, хирургия, роддом. Мы приняли 6 родов. У нас 6 детей родилось в этот период под обстрелом.
Нас кормили солдаты. Они нам давали хлеб с полевой кухни и масло. И они нас кормили, один раз даже паштет дали. Я одному там подарил танк и сказал, что он им поможет быстрее закончить сражение.
هذا هو مسرح الدراما الذي ذاع صيته والذي تضاربت الأخبار عما جرى فيه فعلا.
Люди здесь приезжали со всех районов города и пытались найти убежище. Вот. Тут много было. Мы сюда тоже заходили, когда было еще театр не был разбомблен. Буквально за 2 или 3 дня заходили, было очень много людей, все в фойе лежали.
مشاهد مرعبة مأساوية في مسرح ماريوبول للدراما. منظر بشع، جثث متفحمة لأولئك الذين كانوا يتواجدون في هذا المسرح لحظة الانفجار.
Боевики из Азова используют людей как живой щит и как фактически заложников, удерживая их насильно в одном месте. Здесь у нас есть факты: сгоревшее оружие, документация, форма, которую, видимо, украинские военнослужащие сбросили перед тем, как отступить от этого места. Здесь они были. Это факт. Вероятно, здесь в районе сцены произошел либо подрыв склада боеприпасов, либо целенаправленный подрыв заложенной здесь взрывчатки.
كم من المنازل سيدمر، وكم من نفس ستقتل، وكم من إنسان سيشرد قبل أن يأتي السلام إلى أرض دونباس.
Я очень рад, что 5-я школа заработала, настало мирное небо над головой, и мы можем спокойно дальше учиться.
الحرب شيء فظيع. دعونا نعطي للسلام فرصة وللصبي طفولة.
I think, Mr. I'm sorry I interrupted you, Mr. Arria. Are you going to add something? Do we have connection? Mr. Alabaidi, are you going to say something?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Dipeza. I think the worst thing is to be sighted and not see or not want to see the truth. It is very easy to talk about the war sitting in your chair in the office or in the studio or at home But it is another thing to see it with your own eyes, through the eyes of children who have seen all the horror of war. I have lived in Russia for many years, and I can say with full confidence that Russians do not want war. Residents of Donbass do not want war. And no wonder in well-done Russian song, the following question for a reason is asked, do Russians want a war? Thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Alatai Abadi, and I just want to tell our audience that as you see, we do not censor or edit any of our briefers. And now I would like to welcome Sonja van den Ende from the Netherlands, whose testimonies about the tragedies in Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics are also priceless. Ms. van den Ende, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador and members of the UN, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Last week, I visited the Republic of Luhansk and Donetsk. I went to, first of all, the city of Melitopol. There we heard a statement from the new mayor, and she told us that the former mayor was kidnapped, and now he is released, I heard that, but he is on a tour in Europe. He is on a tour telling that, and on this tour, it's not known that he is a part of the Azov battalion. He is part of the right sector, which is a very right populist party, and he's welcomed in a democratic way in Europe. This is what I cannot understand, that Europe, you know, the democratic Europe, I know, especially the country where I'm from, that is the Netherlands, is giving the floor to people who are right extremists, who definitely have with the Azov battalion, you could see the signs on their costumes, on their outfits, you can see their flags, you can see everything. And we journalists from the West, like my colleague from Italy, are on a list that we are censored in Europe, that we cannot speak the truth. And we were there and we saw the horrible things. I was, for instance, also in Mariupol. I saw the war. I saw what it does with children. I heard the bombardments. I know there was fighting going on in the Azov steel factory. But there's one side of the story, and this one side is only brought to Europe. It's not brought the other side because they don't allow that European journalists even go to Russia, maybe, not from the Russian side, but from the Ukrainian side. You know, like today, Mr. Scholz from Germany, he had to go and apologize because the Ukrainians call him a liverwurst, which is a very terrible name. So, like, if politicians cannot go even to go to Russia or speak with Russia, what do Europe want? Do they want a third world war? It seems like it, because the people in Ukraine, they don't want a third world war. I saw the war in their eyes. I saw what happened. And also, I want to emphasize the tragedy in the theater in Mariupol. I spoke there with a Russian serviceman. He explained that it could not have happened by a bomb because it was the whole building was imploded from inside. So definitely there must have been some weapons or whatever stored under the theater. And also a lot of people, I spoke to some residents, and they all said the night that, or the day that it happened, there were no bombings from Russians. So why we don't hear this story? Why we hear all stories from the Ukrainian side? So where is the free press? Why is RT Russia banned in Europe? Can you tell me this? This is the free democratic Europe where press freedom is on its highest, they always told me. But it's not, it's all censored. So please, members of the UN, try and give the floor to press freedom. Give the floor also to the other side, because in a war, always things happen, but for sure, I'm 100% sure the Russians don't want a war, as the Europeans don't want a war. We see it in Mariupol, we saw it in Melitopol. People don't want war. And the most terrible thing also is that there were a lot of older people left in Mariupol hiding in the basements, and a lot of people told me they were all used as human shields. So this is very, very terrible. And to conclude, please think about it. think about giving away of press freedom, giving away to us, the war journalists who are going to these places, report to you and make sure, or at least make sure that this war is not going to escalate in a third world war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. van den Ende. And our last but not least, of course, guest today is Arria Zoan, editor-in-chief of the Bulgarian edition of Newsfront Agency, who is also very much familiar with the Ukrainian context, in particular Donbass. We have no doubts that our briefers will help to dilute the one-sided media approach to what is happening in the eastern parts of Ukraine, and will allow us to see and hear further testimonies of grave violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes by the Ukrainian armed forces and the nationalistic battalion. Ms. Zoan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me clear?
Yes.
Very good morning, Ambassador, distinguished delegates, and dear colleagues. I want to thank you firstly to my colleagues which start to speak and show the truth. If you allow me, I would like to start with one quote that is really very relevant to the current situation. The last war among people will be a war for truth. This war will be in every single person. War with its own ignorance, aggression, irritation. And only radical transformation of each individual can become the beginning of peaceful life for all people. Before I start with my presentation, which I put Donbass, Life Under Fire and the Criminal Silence of the Civilized World, I have to share that before our meeting today, I was informed and warned that I will never be able to come back to my homeland, Bulgaria, if I took participation in this meeting. But I still took a decision to make a speech today because I believe that this meeting is extremely important for the whole world, society, and global security. I'm Bulgarian journalist. I visit Donbass several times. I see the eyes of people. I see how Ukrainian arms are fire on their homes. And I start to show this in my country. After my first visit, I was uploaded to the scandal website Ukrainian Mirror Forests. I believe that this is also great violation of the international humanitarian law, because today we all together speak about systematic and mass grave violations of the international humanitarian law, as well as other war crimes committed by the Ukrainian military personnel and militia discovered in the course of ongoing special military operation. I want to pay attention on several moments connected with information war, connected with captured sailors, including Bulgarian, by the nationalists of Azov, and also situation about that Ukrainian arms are fired because the United States are supplying a huge quality of weapons. I want to ask one simple question. We all know what is weapon. Weapon is the thing that is using for killing people. So I believe that today there is people from USA, and let me ask you some questions about this. I want to ask if why this money that the United States allocates for weapons and the so-called military assistance is not directing to humanitarian aid, because I believe that Ukrainians do not need weapons. I believe that Ukrainians need food, education, psychological help, and generally life without assistance of USA. I believe that the United States does not supply weapons to Ukraine and force other countries to do so. There will be no death and no war. If the United States did not spend space money on military biological activities in Ukraine, in particular, and globally throughout the entire post-Soviet space, there would be no outbreaks of unfamiliar disease and deaths. Because me and my colleague, Bulgarian journalist Dilyana Gaitunjeva, we make some investigation on this topic. And excuse me, can I ask the USA a question? You are developing biological weapons in Ukraine. Why do you need so many laboratories there? And isn't this a grave violation of international humanitarian human rights? Also, I guess everyone heard about the situation in Mariupol when nationalists from Azov captured several foreign ships, including the Bulgarian ship Tsarevna. Why did the Bulgarian authorities deny that the sailors were rescued by the DPR and the armed force of Russian Federation? And why it is denied that Azov fired from the ship? The retreating response of the nationalists from Azov captured two ships, the Bulgarian Tsarevna and Lady Augusta, and held the crew hostage. The information became known on 10 of April, according to the information of the People's Militia of DPR. On 8th of April, the head of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of DPR, Natalia Nikanorovo, reported that the Ukrainian military had blocked at least 6 foreign ships in the port of Mariupol. They could not leave the harbor because of the threat of using weapons or because of the potential risk that the port water area could be mined. On the blocked ship, in particular, there were citizens of Bulgaria, Syria, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Liberia, and Egypt. I want to make some quote from our Bulgarian sailors, who were saved by DPR and Russian arms Russian, and Russian Federation arms. Our sailor said, firstly, I want to thank DPR from the bottom of my heart for saving us, for evacuating us. It is very touching that people who are on the front line are trying to calm us down. They gave us food, water, canned food, and this is very touching. Say the second engineer on board, Rally Dimov. He explained that the government of Bulgaria was silent because of a political reason. I want to ask, is this a violation of humanitarian international law? Also one quote, only the DPR saved us. There was no one else to take us out, only the DPR and the Russian Federation. Yet about the situation in the port. I thank the DPR and Russia for evacuating us, for treating us well, for giving us food, water, sincere gratitude. Added another sailor, Radoslav Stoyanov. This situation showed that the nationalists of Azov feel so unpunished that they allow themselves to threaten people from other countries even, knowing that or thinking that nothing will happen to them. Is this not an act of gross violation of international humanitarian law? Why does the world community turn a blind eye to such things? Also, about information war. I think everyone knows this incredible woman, Angelina Jolie. I love it from my school years. So Angelina Jolie is incredible woman, great mother, and extremely talented actress. There was a big news when Angelina Jolie came to Ukraine and loved to support the people of Ukraine. As girl, I want to ask Angelina Jolie, why you never come to Donbass for these 8 years? What is the difference between people in Donbass and people in Ukraine? Why we see such a difference between people? Also, if you allow me, from this tribune, I want to make to tell to my Bulgarian authorities, because I'm Bulgarian and my country to supply weapons to Ukraine, because I believe that these weapons are using for killing people and children in Donbass, and we don't have to participate in such a war crime. And I think that it's time people in whole world to speak the truth to stop this war. The situation is simple. USA and other Western countries have to stop to supply arms and weapons to Ukraine, and there will be no war. Now, I believe that Russia is trying and doing her best to stop this nationalist disease, which is going through whole Europe. I believe that the Russian special operation is part of stop, because somebody have to stop USA because they use Ukraine for this terrible war. If there was no weapon supply, there was no such terrible crimes. Me, like journalist, I was watching huge videos from my colleagues, and believe me, I haven't slept, I cry, and this is terrible. But we see video, or we see situation when we go on the place. I believe that this meeting now is really important, because if my colleagues from other countries start to talk about this, we all together could stop this war. We have to point who is guilty about this. I don't want our country, Bulgaria, to support weapons. So allow me to say in my language to my authorities. Уважаемо правителство на България, от високата трибуна на ООН, като българка се обръщам към вас, като дъщеря на родината. Не давайте оръжие на Украйна. Нямаме право да участваме в тази война. Нека войната спре. And now I want you to show one video. Please show the video.
Путину большой привет, спасибо огромное. Подскажите, пожалуйста, как все это время вот здесь было? Мы слышали, просто немножко подслушали, страшные истории происходили.
Очень было жестко. Они прятались на 9-этажках, снайперши сидели именно там, вот где сидели, туда оно и попадало, правильно? А как их выбить? Их никак.
А кто они?
Грубо сказать, фашисты просто-напросто. Их не назвать по-другому.
ВСУ?
И ВСУ, и эти, я уже забыла их название, этих идиотов, азовцы, в частности азовцы. Они становились именно возле 9-этажек, с БТРом заезжали, люди возмущались, что вы делаете, зачем вы становитесь туда. Они говорили, это вам, говорит, за 2014 год, за то, что вы проголосовали, сделали референдум. Вот теперь пожинайте свои плоды, они говорят. И потом сказали, что если вы будете, говорит, мешать, будем стрелять на поражение. У нас горела 9-этажка, мы выселяли людей, помогали просто-напросто, чтобы с 9-этажки в бомбоубежище выселить. Они стреляли мужчин по ногам, чтобы они сидели в детских садиках, в школах. У нас 42-я школа, они сидели там. Они утром спят, сидят, а ночью они выходят, по периметру ходят. И вот это они стреляли мирных жителей.
I would like to thank...
And one more minute before I finish, I want to share some data. According to official data of the Joint Center for Control and Coordination of the DPR, in the territory within the borders before the start of Russian special operation since 17th of February to 6th of May 2022. During the 7-9 days of the escalation, 105 civilians in Donbass were killed, including 3 children. Wounds of varying severity were received by 460 civilians, including 39 children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zoan. I know that it took you courage to take the floor today, because I know that you've been threatened already when they learned that you are going to speak back in your country. It is not a tradition of the Arria-formula meetings that the briefers ask questions to the member states, but if any member state to whom the question was addressed would like to answer, he would be welcome. On the contrary, we would like to have that dialogue interactive, and besides statements, which I would request and plead with you to limit to 3 to 5 minutes in order to let everybody speak. You are also encouraged to ask questions to the briefers as well. And I would like to draw everyone's attention that all materials presented by our briefers and by our mission today are available through the QR code in front of you. Relevant links will be uploaded on the mission's webpage as well as in social media. And now I'd like to give the floor to the council members that wish to take the floor. And I give the floor to India first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor. I thank the briefers for their updates on the topic of today's meeting. We continue to remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation in Ukraine and reiterate call for immediate cessation of violence and end to hostilities. We believe that no solution can be arrived at by shedding blood and at the cost of innocent lives. We have emphasized right from the beginning of the conflict that the path of diplomacy and dialogue should be the only viable option. India has strongly condemned the killing of civilians in Bucha and supported the call for an independent investigation. We support all efforts to alleviate the suffering of the people of Ukraine. We believe that there will be no winning side in this conflict, and while everyone impacted by it will continue to suffer, diplomacy will be a lasting casualty. We welcome the visit by Secretary General to Moscow and Kiev and his engagement with the leadership in the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We agree that the immediate priority is evacuation of civilians from areas witnessing intense fighting. We appreciate the efforts of the United Nations in evacuating civilian population from Mariupol. We hope that these efforts will extend to other areas as well. It is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to this conflict. We continue to reiterate that the global order is anchored on international law, UN Charter, and respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. I thank you.
I thank you, and now I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we have stated before, Mexico is deeply concerned about reports that indicate that as a result of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, we are facing grave breaches of international human rights and international humanitarian law. We reiterate our unequivocal commitment to bring all perpetrators of international crimes to justice and to close the gap to impunity whenever and by whomever committed. The first step towards accountability is the right to the truth. This is why Mexico supported the establishment of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry by the Human Rights Council. We are convinced that the best way to ensure access to justice is by having independent and impartial assessments of the situation on the ground. In this context, we call on all states to allow and support the ongoing investigations of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court regarding the situation in Ukraine. Full cooperation with this process that would examine the alleged commission of international crimes by any party involved in the conflict is the best way to ensure accountability. In this regard, we call once again for an immediate cessation of hostilities. If there is a genuine will to fight impunity, such efforts cannot and should not be blocked, hampered, or impeded. A truthful attempt to seek justice would allow nothing less than that and should enable and guarantee utmost transparency. Therefore, we need impartial and fact-checked information by neutral sources that would also put an end to the information war that has further fueled the animosity between the parties and the international community at large. To conclude, Mr. Chair, Mexico reiterates its call on all states that support accountability in Ukraine and elsewhere to adhere to the Rome Statute. This could be the most sensible thing to do in congruency with the messages and calls we have heard today and in the past weeks. I thank you.
I thank you, and I recognize the permanent representative of France.
Mr. President, I participate in this meeting organized by the Russian mission to convey a simple message. Russia will not succeed in transforming into realities the fantasies it uses to justify atrocities in its war of aggressions against Ukraine. In the face of these outrageous disinformation maneuvers, we in the United Nations must rely first and foremost on the facts established by the competent bodies of the United Nations system. The General Assembly has repeatedly and forcefully denounced Russia's aggression in violation of the UN Charter. The International Court of Justice established on March 16 that Russia's military operations in Ukraine shall be suspended. Given the account of the atrocities committed by the Russian army in Ukraine, we must ensure there is no impunity for the perpetrators of violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. France supports all efforts to ensure that the facts are established impartially and independently, and that those responsible for crimes committed in Ukraine are held accountable. We support the work of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. We supported the establishment by the Human Rights Council of a commission of inquiry and referred the situation in Ukraine to the ICC prosecutor. We welcome the opening of the investigation and the deployment of a team on the ground. France is providing concrete support to the ICC, including through a voluntary contribution of 500,000 euros. We call on all states to support and cooperate with the impartial fact-finding mechanism and international courts. We have also sent investigators on the ground to support the Ukrainian authorities' investigations efforts. I would also like to counter the political narrative that Russia presents about the situation in Ukraine before the aggression of February 24, 2022. France has worked tirelessly since 2015, together with Germany, for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, to which both Russia and Ukraine had subscribed in order to put an end to the war in the Donbass. The implementation of these agreements was not an easy task, but it was a peaceful way to resolve the situation in the region. It was Russia and Russia alone that chose to put an end to the path of dialogue and negotiation and to resort to violence and destruction. Mr. President, in their headlong rush to justify what cannot be justified, the Russian authorities are resorting to the worst outrages, the historical manipulation that the Russian Foreign Minister and his ministry are indulging in on the atrocities of the Second World War is just abject. We condemn this unacceptable and abhorrent rhetoric. We will continue to fight against Russian disinformation in Ukraine. These outrages are dangerous. The Russian authorities, by trivializing hate speech, are enabling the worst atrocities to take place. They must be held accountable. Thank you very much.
I thank you. I wish the French ambassador was here from the beginning to listen firsthand to the witnesses that our briefers presented. And as I said when he was absent, we never edited or censored what they were saying. And indeed, I think the idea to find the perpetrators of the war crimes that are committed in Ukraine are being committed in Ukraine, in particular by Ukrainian nationalist battalions, to which there are testimonies that were presented today, is also a thing which our investigative committee is engaged with. I'm sure that will be documented, and that is already being documented and will be presented in due course. Now I give the floor to the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the briefers for their participation and would like to make brief remarks. First, I would once again underline that it is civilians who bear the highest cost of war. We are concerned by the scale of disinformation and hate speech that has been amplified by technology and has been harmful to both civilians and humanitarian workers. We must instead focus on determining the facts on the ground through impartial investigation, data collection, and reporting. We appreciate all journalists who risk their lives on the front lines of conflict in an effort to provide accurate reporting even in the most difficult situations. Second, we reiterate our call on the parties to the conflict to strictly and fully abide by their obligation under international humanitarian law. We stress the need for accountability so that justice for victims and survivors is served. Third, we appreciate the efforts of the Secretary General, including his visit to Russia and Ukraine. We welcome and are encouraged by the progress we have seen in recent days in the safe evacuation of civilians through coordination of the UN, authorities of Ukraine and Russian Federation, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. We are hopeful that further progress can be made to facilitate voluntary and safe passage for civilians caught up in this conflict. To conclude, we reiterate our deep concern about the terrible toll this conflict has had on civilians in Ukraine, and our call for cessation of hostilities and a negotiated solutions to this conflict. The UAE stands in support of efforts to facilitate dialogue and bring an end to this war. As the SG stressed yesterday, it is imperative for the sake of the people of Ukraine, Russia, and the entire world. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and now I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Chair. Allow me at the outset to express Norway's concern regarding the framing of the topic for today's discussion and the allegations presented in the concept note. Yet again, we're witnessing the Russian Federation's misuse of the United Nations and its privileged position within it, as a platform for disinformation and as a smokescreen to draw attention away from the brutal warfare it is waging against the Ukrainian people. The intensity of this disinformation campaign is alarming. Russia has failed to offer any credible evidence for its accusations or to cooperate with international bodies tasked with gathering facts and documentation. Russia has instead made unsubstantiated claims and insinuations. Today's meeting is nothing more than another attempt to spread confusion and deflect attention from Russia's role as aggressor in the illegal invasion of Ukraine. The UN Charter applies to all nations, including Russia. There is no doubt that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. It is not a special military operation. It is an illegal aggression against another sovereign country. It is a war of choice. Norway is appalled by Russia's methods of warfare. Numerous credible reports have described in horrible detail the relentless attacks and unimaginable atrocities committed against civilians. These atrocities shock the very conscience of humanity. There are clear and abundant indications of systematic and large-scale war crimes being committed by the Russian armed forces and their proxies, as outlined in the OSCE Moscow Mechanism report. The adoption of the General Assembly of the resolution Aggression against Ukraine, calling on all parties to strictly respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law, sent an important signal from the international community. Violations of international law cannot go unchallenged. International law is not optional. All reports of atrocities must be properly investigated, and the perpetrators of any crimes be brought to justice. The same resolution clearly names Russia as the aggressor. This is a fundamental fact. We will not be fooled by attempts to divert attention from its own crimes by shamelessly launching a barrage of accusations at the very state it has attacked. Thank you.
Thank you. Frankly, I was a bit surprised when we were accused, not the first time, of course, for use of the UN as a platform for disinformation. Today, we are not speaking, we are just providing the floor for the people who have first-hand experience on what is happening at the front line and how they survived and who were those who committed atrocities there. And these are not our words. I mean, as I said, we never censored anything that they wanted to say. This is an account of journalists who interviewed those people. If you don't want to hear, that's another question. If you prefer to stay comfortably numb, as Pink Floyd said, that's your choice. But the purpose of today's event, to give the floor to those who can give the testimony, not to spread propaganda, as you said. Now I give the floor to Albany.
Mr. Chair, the unprovoked and unjustified military aggression of Russia in Ukraine has entered the third month, and we and the entire world continue to witnessing the same. A continued violation of international law and the UN Charter, a continued humanitarian tragedy in Ukraine, and repercussions throughout the globe. We have made our positions and views continuously clear in the UN Security Council chamber and outside. But we would like to highlight a few key points. First, Russian armed forces continue to indiscriminately shell and bomb populated areas, killing civilians and attacking hospitals, schools, and civilian infrastructure, actions that may amount to war crimes, as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has repeatedly stated. According to the latest figures of his office, there are 6,546 civilian casualties in the country, 3,193 killed and 3,000 353 injured by an army that pretended that it won't harm civilians. Second, the conflict has caused the world's fastest growing displacement crisis since the Second World War. Over a quarter of Ukraine's population, with more than 12 million people, have fled their homes. More than 7.7 million people now estimated to be internally displaced, and over 5.2 million people who have crossed borders to seek security and safety in other countries, most of them women and children. More than 12 million people are in need of urgent humanitarian aid, including food, medical supplies, and shelter. Third, there should be no doubt whatever who is the aggressor and who is the victim. As we heard today in the framework of the disinformation campaign as well, Russia has invaded its neighbor, pretending violations of the rights of the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine. There are competent and efficient international institutions where these concerns could have been addressed. The International Court of Justice has found no evidence of the alleged crimes committed by Ukrainians and has formally ordered Russia to immediately stop its military aggression in Ukraine. Fourth, governments and international judicial bodies have initiated a number of accountability efforts in response to the crimes in Ukraine. On March 2nd, the ICC prosecutor announced the opening of a formal investigation, while authorities in different countries have opened their own criminal investigations under the principle of universal jurisdiction. On March 4th, the UN Human Rights Council voted to establish an international commission of inquiry to document war crimes and human rights abuses. Albania is among the 43 countries and EU countries that referred the situation in Ukraine to the Prosecutor General of the ICC just a few days after the beginning of the conflict. The international civil society organizations and independent media have an essential role to play in pursuing justice in Ukraine, including in documentation, capacity building, research, and advocacy, as well as with outreach to victims and affected communities. We commend the civil organizations and thank them for their remarkable work done so far. They are giving a substantial contribution in documenting and preparing the necessary legal evidence to ensure accountability. The Ukrainian people need justice, and the perpetrators will not be allowed to get away with crime. Last, Russia keeps repeating its false narrative, but it did not manage to convince the International Court of Justice. It has not managed to convince the United Nations General Assembly, and it has not managed to convince the world. We call on Russia instead to do the only right thing possible: stop its aggression, withdraw all its troops, and respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank you. I still hear how Russia is accused of disinformation. I have a question, perhaps rhetorical, to you. And what do you consider information? The testimony of the witnesses? This is disinformation? Or you consider information, an interview with the survivor of Azovstal by Reuters, which was redacted to turn the meaning of the interview upside down? This is information for you. This is a rhetorical question. You are not requested to answer. Now I give the floor to Ghana. Sorry, you want to answer, please.
During this time here, I was wondering how can be that such independent journalists have recognized so-called republics in Ukraine? On personal capacity, on which capacity? Thank you.
They are not countries to recognize any legal entity. They are just working there. They have been there. They've been interviewing the people. I don't know what you mean by recognition. They are just journalists doing their job, interviewing people at areas where they are. Now I give the floor to Ghana.
Mr. Chair, we thank you for your remarks and have taken note of the information provided by the presenters. Such deep suffering of any people is indeed troubling and should not be the characterization of conflict at this time of humanity's history. Ghana maintains that all violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law as well as atrocities committed by whomever in Ukraine, should be the subject of independent, impartial, and thorough investigations to establish the facts, assign responsibility, and hold all perpetrators accountable for their actions and inactions. We stress the importance of our collective support to ensure accountability and prevent impunity, and underscore in this context the role of the media in highlighting the facts and documenting admissible evidence to support effective accountability. We remain deeply concerned about the military escalations which have given rise to the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation and urge compliance with obligations and commitments under international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights laws. We reiterate the necessity of an immediate cessation of hostilities, which has formed the breeding ground for the systematic violations of the rights of the people and the very principles and values that bind the international community. We conclude by emphasizing that a sustainable solution to the conflict can only be arrived through diplomacy and a constructive dialogue among the parties and stakeholders. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Russia's war against Ukraine has already caused unimaginable human suffering. As we have moved from measuring its duration in weeks to months, we are also left with no doubt that the death toll will continue to mount. From the moment its troops crossed the Ukrainian border, Russia's invasion has been, and continues to be, in violation of international law. We have seen a complete disregard for the UN Charter down to its most basic principles, seeking to undermine the international legal order. We have seen the Geneva Conventions and their first additional protocol, foundational instruments of international humanitarian law, flouted by Russian armed forces. From attacks on nuclear power plants to the shelling of homes, hospitals, kindergartens, and train stations. Russian forces appear clearly to have violated the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. We continue to hear reports of the deliberate killing of civilians in summary executions and the use of torture and rape by the Russian military, all of which can constitute war crimes. In the face of this disrespect for international law, there have been unprecedented calls for accountability for crimes committed in the wake of Russia's invasion. These calls have been matched by the international community's swift action, including the establishment of the Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, the investigation of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, documentation by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and reporting by the OSCE Moscow Mechanism's mission of experts. Russia's constant criticism and refusal to engage with these bodies speaks volumes on how little it values achieving accountability in Ukraine. Accountability requires us to get to the truth, and in order for this to happen, independent international investigators require safe and unhindered access to all affected areas in Ukraine, as well as access to information. Evidence needs to be preserved in order to ensure that there will be no impunity. Ultimately, individual criminal responsibility for war crimes committed in Ukraine must be determined by a fair trial before a court or tribunal in full compliance with international rules and laws. Russia's tactics of subversion and disinformation deter us in our support for justice, will not deter us in our support for justice for Ukraine and its people. In conclusion, as the Secretary General has said about the war in Ukraine, and I quote, "Something that is unfortunately always true, civilians always pay the highest price," end of quote. And to Russia we say, there is one very simple way to halt this suffering. Stop this unjustifiable war. Thank you, Chair.
I thank you, and I now give the floor to the United States.
We're not going to legitimize today's discussion by delivering a lengthy formal statement. Russia's actions speak for themselves time and time again. Today is no different. Russia's misuse of the Security Council and the UN is not new. In the wake of Moscow's brutal, unjustified, and unprovoked war, it has called for briefings and informal Arria-formula discussions numerous times to spew falsehoods. And this trend started long before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine this year. The Russian Federation's mission to the UN has been using the Security Council to spread disinformation, lies, and false narratives for years. The representative of the Russian Federation seems to think that repeating lies makes them true, but it only makes Russia's tactics more transparent for the entire world to see. Russia has never been more isolated. As the United States has said before, Russia must stop its war of aggression against Ukraine and stop using the Security Council to spread lies and disinformation.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to the United Kingdom.
It has often been said about propaganda that a lie told often enough becomes the truth. We have a duty to stop that from happening. The Russian Federation systematically attempts to spread false narratives about neo-Nazis and imaginary NATO threats against Russia to justify its illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. But it won't succeed because the facts tell a different story. The truth is, Russia was responsible for the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. Russia instigated and fueled a secessionist conflict in eastern Ukraine, which dragged on for almost 8 years and led to the deaths of over 13,000 people. Russian-backed separatists with a Russian BUK missile shot down Malaysian flight MH17 over Ukraine, killing 298 innocent civilians. And then Russia amassed over 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border under the false pretense of exercises and launched a full-scale, unprovoked, premeditated attack against a sovereign democratic state. This invasion has been overwhelmingly condemned by the international community, and the Ukrainian people have resisted it heroically. The Kremlin uses disinformation operations to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty, to create false pretexts, to obscure the truth, and to hide the brutality of its assault on Ukraine's people. Today's meeting is a further example. All credible allegations of crimes on the territory of Ukraine should be investigated. We are supporting the Ukrainian Prosecutor General with her investigations into war crimes, as well as the work of the ICC. We welcome President Zelensky's commitment that the perpetrators of all war crimes in Ukraine should face justice. There is no such commitment from the Russian regime. This is because Russian forces are perpetrating heinous crimes in their desperation to claim military victory. In Irpin, Bucha, Mariupol, and elsewhere, Russians have murdered civilians and buried them in mass graves. Russia has attacked schools, sheltering civilians, and abducted and forcibly removed Ukrainians to Russia. These are acts of desperation as Putin fails to achieve his objectives in Ukraine. In the face of Russian aggression, we must remain resolute in our support for a free, sovereign, and independent Ukraine, in our defense of the UN Charter, and in our determination to counter Russian attempts to debase the United Nations as a forum for disinformation. We must never allow Russian lies to become the truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Two short comments. It was surprising to me to hear from the guardian of the international legal system about a few things, in particular on MH17, which is still being discussed at the Dutch court. Perhaps you know the results already. That's why you're so assured that Russia has done it before the court made a decision. And perhaps you are so sure that Bucha, a provocation that we exposed, you're so sure it was done by Russians, that's why you didn't give us a chance to call for an urgent meeting of the Security Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have listened with concern to the serious allegations of violation of international humanitarian law and in international human rights law. We also recall the charges of similar gravity during the Arria-formula meeting on ensuring accountability for atrocities committed in Ukraine held last week on 27th of April. Our solidarity is with the people of Ukraine who are suffering from the attacks, atrocities, and war crimes underway. We offer their families and friends our deepest condolences. We also recognize the agony of survivors and families that comes with the deliberate or accidental distortion of their experiences in public record. As such, we must observe that there are unprecedented efforts by multiple organized state and non-state actors to shape the information environment. To the extent that charges of human rights violations, rather than being the basis of a ceasefire, mediation and accountability are part of the strategic conflict. As individual delegations, we lack the mandate and ability to verify the reports we are receiving from the media. Fortunately, the United Nations has the credibility and means to undertake a thorough investigation into the human rights violations underway in Ukraine. To deliver on this responsibility, 3 actions are required. Number 1, first, all allegations from all parties should be treated seriously by the Council and relevant UN bodies. 2, all conflicting parties, including those making allegations of human rights abuses or who stand accused, should agree to prompt, independent, and impartial investigations. Third, all conflicting parties should cooperate with the UN organs and agencies charged with the responsibility to conduct investigations and abide by the findings thereof. Chair, we urge the conflicting parties to be aware of the risk of escalation that may grow in line with the inflamed public mood due to these serious allegations. The combination of angry domestic and global publics, the emerging rhetoric of this war having existential implications, and advanced weaponry can make this catastrophe markedly worse. We further urge all mainstream media and social media outlets to be extremely careful in their verification processes, as well as detection and disruption of organized cyber operations that use atrocities as one more dimension of war. Finally, we recommend that the parties of these obligations, finally, we remind the parties of their obligations under Article 2 of the Charter. I thank you.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I prepared my remarks in French, and I wanted to deliver it in French, but for us not to inconvenience the colleagues, I will try to restitute it in English. So, Mr. President, the war in Ukraine has been going on for 72 days now. Every day has its share of dead, of course combatants of the belligerent forces, but above all civilians in very large number. The violence of the fighting is accompanied by the destruction of civilians' properties, flows of refugees and displaced persons, in particular women and children, many of whom are victims of inhuman treatment. So many violations of the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols which regulate war and protect people who do not take or who are no longer able to take part in the fighting. This is why, in the drive to condemn atrocities and abuses of international humanitarian law, it is important to bear in mind the stark reality that there is no war crimes without war. And as long as the fighting continues, as long as weapons continue to be the mode of expression, the door is open to violations of all kinds. Clearly, Mr. President, war is absurd, and its consequences are dehumanizing. It is essential that allegations of atrocities, abuses, and mass crimes be investigated in independent and impartial way in order to establish the facts and determine the responsibilities. My delegation takes this opportunity to call on the belligerent to put an end to the fighting. This is the only way out of the current situation. We believe that there is still time to get out of the logic of belligerence and give peace and peaceful coexistence a chance. Diplomacy must resume its course, and the bilateral and the multilateral initiatives of recent days must be intensified and be part of the objective of ending the war. Each of the parties must engage in good faith in the discussions with the firm will to silence the guns. My country is concerned about the signals tending to prolong the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine should not be added to the list of protracted conflicts. We must end this war. Mr. President, it is crucial that diplomacy prevail over war. I would therefore like to reiterate my country's call for the establishment of a ceasefire, to encourage ongoing dialogue initiatives, and above all, to call on the belligerent to allow unimpeded access for humanitarian aid intended to people in distress caught in the grip of the fightings. I thank you.
Thank you, and now I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We thank you for the information you provided. I also thank the journalists for their briefings. We also thank our mission for making the information presented retrievable by the QR code link. Mr. Chair, as we enter into yet another week of the conflict in Ukraine, we continue to witness intense human suffering with appalling scenes of thousands of desperate civilians trapped in the battlefield. Once again, we renew our plea for a broad, effective, and immediate ceasefire and call on Russia and Ukraine to resume negotiations conducive to a political solution to the conflict. Only after the silence of the guns and the withdrawal of troops are achieved, will it be possible to halt the immense toll of human lives this conflict has brought upon. We call on Russia and Ukraine to work towards agreements to allow civilians wishing to flee the hostilities to those in safety. Those who decide to stay cannot become targets of attacks. In the same vein, parties must grant safe passage to relief consignments to those in need, adopt adequate measures to prevent disappearances, and share information on the status of protected persons under their control. Brazil reiterates the call for all parties to fully respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. The causes of the conflict, whatever they are, do not exempt the parties from their universal obligations to guarantee that civilians be protected, that the wounded receive medical care, that humanitarian assistance reach those in need, and that detainees be treated humanly in all circumstances. There must be no politicization of humanitarian actions, nor selective application of international humanitarian law. Also, geopolitical objectives must not supersede the endeavor for peace, nor prolong the human suffering caused by war. Regarding the disturbing reports about gender-related violence, targeting of civilians, placing of weapons near civilian infrastructure, bombing of residential areas, massacre of innocents, and torture of prisoners, we favor the independent and thorough investigation of these human rights violations. Perpetrators must be held accountable. Promoting compliance with international humanitarian law, protecting civilians, calling for peace. These are the objectives that should unite rather than divide us. And I thank you.
Thank you, and I'll give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. China is deeply saddened by the increasing civilian casualties in Ukraine. We call on relevant parties to exercise maximum restraint, minimize the damage to civilians and civilian infrastructure, and facilitate civilian evacuation and humanitarian operations. At the same time, prisoner of war should be treated humanely in accordance with Geneva Conventions. On humanitarian front, we call for the strengthened communication and coordination among parties concerned, and we welcome the agreement reached by Russia and Ukraine with the coordination of UN and ICRC on the evacuation of civilians from Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. Under international humanitarian law, civilians should be spared of any forms of violence in armed conflicts. Attacks against civilians are not acceptable and should not occur. The relevant circumstances and specific causes of incidents should be verified and established. Any accusations should be based on facts. Before the full picture is clear, all sides should be exercise restraint and avoid unfounded accusations. The relevant international mechanisms should remain objective and impartial. They should work in strict accordance with the mandates to avoid politicization. The prospect of an extended and prolonged conflict is worrying. Dialogue and negotiation is the only viable way to prevent further escalation. We all see that Russia and Ukraine have already accumulated some bases in previous negotiations, and we believe talks should continue despite difficulties. The international community should foster enabling conditions and atmosphere for the negotiations and political settlement instead of fueling tensions. China, on its part, will continue its constructive role in solving the Ukraine crisis. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank you, and now I give the floor to Syria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
my delegation, the Syrian Arab Republic, thanks the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for organizing this important meeting, which provides an opportunity for the member states to realize the truth of what is happening in Ukraine and to expose the false allegations and misleading Western campaigns aimed at harming the Russian Federation. I would also like to thank the briefers for the valuable information provided. My delegation condemns the orchestrated campaign launched by Western countries and their media arms against the Russian Federation, which includes the dissemination of disinformation, false accusations, fabricated photos, and video aimed at undermining the legitimate right of the Russian Federation to ward off threats to the security of its people as guaranteed by the UN Charter. The paradox is that the countries that wage their hostile campaign against the Russian Federation today and criticize its defense of its security against threats existing on its direct borders are the same countries that have launched barbaric, aggressive acts, targeting member states that are thousands of miles far away and don't pose any direct or direct threat under the false pretext of defending their national security. These countries destroy entire cities and kill thousands of civilians, as was the case with the Syrian city of Raqqa and the Al-Baghouz area. The Western approach towards the special military operation in Ukraine is an example of the selective and double standard policies pursued by the United States and its NATO allies, as these countries have ignored the discriminative and inhuman practices of Kiev authorities against the people of Donetsk and Luhansk and their continuous suffering for 8 years since the coup in Ukraine in 2014. Not only that, but those countries violated the pledges they made to the Russian Federation 3 decades ago and sought to extend NATO to the east to threaten Russian national security. They also deliberately fueled tension and turned Ukraine into a battlefield with Russia by supporting Kiev authorities with weapons and foreign fighters in a manner similar to the sending thousands of foreign tourist fighters to spread chaos and destruction in Syria. My delegation strongly condemns the violations of the rules of the international humanitarian law by the Ukrainian armed forces and the national paramilitary battalions and calls on them to refrain from using civilians as human shields and to desist from their crimes those worsen the humanitarian situation. My country appreciates the efforts of the Russian Federation to achieve stability, ensure the safety and the security of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples, host hundreds of thousands of refugees, ensure the delivery of the aid, and provide safe corridors for civilians. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank you, and I gather there are no more speakers that would like to take the floor, unless indicated otherwise. And I think that would be appropriate to give the floor to our briefers to hear their opinion, what they heard today. I would request them to be brief and not to exceed their comments beyond, say, 3 minutes. And first, I'd like to give the floor in the reverse order to Ms. Asya Zuan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask the representatives of Norway, Albania, and Ireland, United Kingdom, who calls Russian special operation aggression and use such words like Russian invasion and etc. Gentlemen and lady from Norway, dear delegates, have you ever been in Donbass? And why you never ask about people who were killed by Ukrainian army? Is it fair? Where do you get information that gives you the right to accuse Russia of killing civilians? Are you sure? It is strange to hear accusations from those who have never been to the Donbass and have no idea what is happening there. My question is, are you ready personal to visit and meet civilians in Donbass to ask them how they live under fire all these 8 years and who is shooting? Are you ready? Norway, United Kingdom, Ireland. Have you ever been there? Thank you so much.
I thank you, Ms. Zuan. As I said earlier, it is not in the tradition of the Arria-formula meetings to ask the participants. It should have been otherwise. They should have been asking you questions if they chose to do so. But nobody did. Everybody spoke. Just spoke. We had no interactive dialogue, in which I think that not too many here in this room are ready for. Let me consider your question to those delegations that you mentioned rhetorical, and we'll continue further. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Sonja van den Ende.
Thank you very much. I would just like to make a remark to the members of the so-called Free Western World who are part of the United Nations. And then I mean Albania, I mean Norway, England, the United States. They keep on talking of one side. It's like they already condemned Russia without listening to the other side. They speak highly about the International Court, of which the United States are not a member. So how can they do that? Why are they take this side? Do they have an agenda? Do they want a world war or what? Why are we journalists not questioned? Why are we not believed? Why do you not even listen to us? And this is really horrible for an institute like the United Nations, where the nations should be united, where the truth should be questioned for every nation and not taking one side. This is not justice. This is taking one side without questioning. Thank you very much. I hope it will improve your mentality, and I hope the United Nations, their actions will be improved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. van den Ende, and now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Salam Al-Abaidi.
Thank you, sir. Also, I have remarks about the accusation of the Russian Federation of bad using of the United Nations and the Security Council. I just want to know and ask and to remind about the glass tube with white powder. Who did that? Who disinformed the whole world about the dangers of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction? I want to remind that Russia, when the United States and Britain launched an aggressive war against Iraq, my country, Iraq, and occupied my country, Russia did not wish that America and Britain and their allies to be defeated in Iraq, realizing that it could only move the West to even greater crimes against humanity, even to the use of nuclear weapons. And I want to ask today, as a rhetoric, why the West wants and does everything to achieve the defeat of Russia. Does the West want a third world war? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Al-Abaidi. I think we are coming to an end of our meeting, and I would like to once again thank briefers and not just briefers, but those who they interviewed, which is perhaps more important, because these are people who are not sitting at the table. They find themselves in often terrible conditions, but they gave you an account why these conditions became possible. And unlike what we hear in the mainstream media today, they clearly said who is to blame for what has happened to them and what is happening to them today. Colleagues, we hope that this meeting was useful to present not even an alternative, but the true accounts of those witnesses. And of course, if you're, whatever their opinion was, but if your eyes and ears are close to the truth and you read from your papers your national statements, we cannot do anything with it, only to try to still come with the true accounts of those who can testify. Again, maybe for some of you it is comfortable to be comfortably numb, as I said already, but it will not change the truth. And you heard this truth today from residents of the east and south of Ukraine and the journalists who work there. So open your eyes and embrace the truth, no matter how cruel or uncomfortable it is. I thank you very much for participating in this meeting. I thank our briefers. I thank those who are behind the scenes, those who were interviewed. Thank you very much.